When we think about love in the Middle Ages, the first image that often comes to mind is a chivalrous knight kneeling before a lady, offering his sword and soul in undying devotion. While that image isn't entirely fictional, especially in the poetic world of troubadours, it only scratches the surface of what love, marriage, and gender actually meant to people during that time. In truth, love in the Middle Ages was complicated, often pragmatic, and deeply influenced by religion, law, and class. For the vast majority of people, especially peasants and tradesfolk, marriage was less about romance and more about survival. A union meant combining labor, land, and lineage. Who you married determined your economic future, your social status, and the prospects of your children. Yet even within these constraints, love found a way to flourish. Let's begin with marriage customs. While arranged marriages were common, especially among the nobility, consent was still a core part of the church's definition of a valid marriage. Yes, even in the 12th century, two people declaring their commitment in private, in front of witnesses, could be considered married under canon law. This was revolutionary. It gave individuals, particularly women, a surprising degree of agency, especially in an era often thought to be entirely patriarchal. Still, gender roles were sharply defined. A man was expected to provide, protect, and preside. A woman was expected to serve, obey, and bear children, but the reality, as usual, was far messier. Women ran businesses, managed households, inherited property, and even governed regions, particularly if widowed or from a noble class. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine didn't just marry kings, they shaped politics, sponsored poets, and led armies. Love itself, the emotional, irrational, soul-deep kind, was both celebrated and feared. Church leaders warned of lust as a gateway to sin, yet medieval literature overflowed with passionate affairs, romantic tragedies, and heartbreaks. Think of Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere, tales of forbidden desire that still echo in modern romances. These stories reflect a culture deeply preoccupied with the tension between duty and emotion, salvation and longing. And what of ordinary people? Contrary to what you might think, medieval lovers left behind letters, songs, and even graffiti that testify to their emotions. In a 14th century English chapel, a visitor etched, "Alicia, I am yours." In French love poetry from the 1200s, a shepherd tells his beloved, "Without your kiss, the sun has no light." These aren't just courtly allusions, they are human voices from centuries ago, whispering truths we still recognize today. Women's lives, however, were tightly regulated. A woman's honor was tied to her chastity, and her reputation was fragile. Adultery could be punished severely, and illegitimate children were often shunned. Yet in rural villages and urban quarters, life was nuanced. Midwives, wise women, and female healers became guardians of female knowledge, offering advice on fertility, childbirth, and relationships. While the church sought to dominate ideas of morality, the real world followed its own rhythms, especially among the lower classes. It's also important to note that not all love fit within traditional norms. Monastic love, for instance, often involved deep emotional bonds between monks or nuns, expressed in letters that read as tender as any lover's confession. And while homosexuality was condemned officially, records show that same-sex relationships, both emotional and physical, existed, sometimes hidden, sometimes ignored, sometimes punished, but undeniably human. In times of war and plague, love became both more urgent and more tender. The fragility of life meant that affections were fierce and fast. People clung to one another with an intensity that defies modern cynicism. A 1349 letter from a husband to his wife during the Black Death reads, "If death takes me, know that I have loved you with the strength of 100 lifetimes." And in the rituals of courtship, whether through dances, festivals, or quiet exchanges of gifts, medieval people poured poetry into even the briefest encounters. A flower left on a windowsill, a ribbon slipped into a sleeve. A song sung outside a cottage in the moonlight. No, the Middle Ages weren't devoid of love. If anything, they remind us that even in the darkest times, the human heart beats with astonishing clarity. Behind the armor, beneath the veils, people yearned, hoped, sacrificed, and dreamed, just like we do. If you were sick in the Dark Ages, your options were complicated. Modern eyes often dismiss medieval medicine as nothing more than superstition and bloodletting, and in some cases, that's not far from the truth. But beneath the surface, a fragile and often beautiful effort to understand the human body was unfolding, one deeply influenced by religion, nature, and desperation. The first and most important fact about medicine in the Middle Ages is this: there were no doctors in the way we think of them today. Instead, there were monks, herbalists, midwives, barbers, and wise women, each with fragments of knowledge passed down through generations, texts, and trial and error. In monasteries, monks preserved ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, particularly those of Galen and Hippocrates. But these texts were filtered through religious doctrine, which meant the balance of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, was not just physical but spiritual. A fever, too much blood, you'd be bled with a leech or blade. A sadness that wouldn't lift, perhaps your black bile was out of control, or perhaps it was a demon. Mental illness, in particular, was viewed through a religious lens. People might be prayed over, exorcised, or, tragically, imprisoned for being touched by the devil. But not all was dark. Herbal medicine was incredibly rich and in many ways ahead of its time. Medieval healers knew the power of willow bark for pain, garlic for infection, and honey for wound healing, practices modern science would later confirm. The leech books of Anglo-Saxon England are filled with hundreds of remedies based on plants, minerals, and even charms, showing a complex blend of observation and belief. Then there were the plague doctors and apothecaries in cities, often wearing robes, masks, and a strange mix of confidence and fear. They carried pomanders filled with fragrant herbs to ward off miasmas, bad air, a theory they believed spread disease. Their understanding of germs was absent, but their attempt to create cleanliness, quarantine, and mask filters were early echoes of today's infection control. Still, superstition was inseparable from care. A person with epilepsy might be told to carry a piece of iron or drink water that had soaked a church relic. A woman in childbirth might be given a holy talisman to protect her and her child from evil spirits. The line between magic and medicine blurred, because when death was close and medicine uncertain, faith filled the void. One of the most poignant realities of medieval life was how vulnerable people were to the simplest of ailments. A tooth infection, a fever, a broken bone, things we treat in a single hospital visit today could and did end lives, yet communities rallied, neighbors made poultices, priests delivered last rites. Families burned incense, whispered prayers, and hoped that the Virgin Mary or Saint Sebastian would intercede. And let us not forget the women, the healers who passed down remedies in whispers and rituals, who treated fevers with elderflower, who caught babies and saved mothers. Many of them were later persecuted as witches, not because they practiced evil, but because they dared to hold knowledge outside the church's control. There is a quiet courage in all of this. In the absence of certainty, people still fought for life. They brewed teas, made ointments, memorized chants, and studied the stars. Their cures weren't always effective, but they were rooted in a desire to heal, to help, to survive. It's easy to laugh at the leech or the bleeding bowl, but it's harder to ignore the humanity behind the hands that offered them, hoping to ease a loved one's suffering. Medieval medicine wasn't just about what worked. It was about hope in the face of the unknown and the deep human instinct to comfort, to cure, and to believe. When we picture the working class of the Middle Ages, we often imagine dirty peasants in ragged tunics toiling endlessly in fields, ignorant and simple. But that vision is not only shallow, it's wrong. Behind every plowed field, every stitched garment, every carved wooden beam or stone arch was a person who understood their work as deeply as a modern engineer or designer. The medieval world, though lacking formal science, was a hive of skilled labor, intricate craftsmanship, and quietly brilliant innovation. Let's begin in the fields. Farming was backbreaking, yes, but also incredibly intelligent. Without machines, medieval farmers developed complex systems of crop rotation, learned to read the weather by the wind and clouds, and memorized lunar cycles to guide planting. They created communal grazing systems, managed irrigation channels with precision, and selected seeds over generations to improve yields. Their hands may have been rough, but their knowledge was sophisticated, experiential, and essential to survival. Then there were the artisans, the weavers, blacksmiths, masons, potters, and carpenters. They were not just workers, but creators of a world we still live in. A stonemason carving the gargoyle on a cathedral had no formal education, but he understood geometry, weight distribution, and the play of shadow on stone. A weaver spinning wool into richly dyed fabric held in her fingers the secrets of chemistry, tension, and pattern design passed down through generations. Guilds, which began forming in the later Middle Ages, protected this expertise. These weren't just labor unions, they were communities of skill, regulating standards, preserving trade secrets, and training apprentices through decade-long mentorships. To become a master in a guild was not easy. It required proof of excellence, a literal masterpiece. Your work had to speak for itself, judged by your peers, not based on theories but on results that could be touched, used, admired. Even in the so-called darkest corners of society, there was ingenuity. Poor families turned leftover bones into tools, repurposed old fabric into new garments, crafted baskets from twigs, and built clay ovens with nothing but hands and earth. Waste was not an option, creativity was survival, and the work didn't stop at the practical. Many medieval crafts were profoundly beautiful. Illuminated manuscripts were painted by candlelight with brushes made of squirrel hair. Woodcut altars were carved with such depth and emotion that even modern sculptors still study them. Tapestries told stories of wars, myths, and dreams, and were used not just for decoration, but to keep cold stone walls warm. Children were often part of this world early. They weren't just playing, they were learning trades, helping families, tending goats, grinding grain, gathering herbs. Childhood as we think of it today didn't exist, but that doesn't mean they didn't laugh, learn, or find joy in creation. Their lives were full of responsibility, but also rhythm, pride, and purpose. To live in the Middle Ages was to live by your hands, and for many, those hands were masters of forgotten wisdom, a kind of intelligence that didn't require books or degrees but demanded intuition, memory, and practice. Today we may overlook the genius of a perfectly balanced wheelbarrow, a weatherproof thatched roof, or a loom-built garment, but those things were once marvels, and the people who made them were the quiet geniuses of their age. In rediscovering how people worked in the Dark Ages, we begin to see a world not of savagery, but of ingenuity woven into every day. Why is it that when we hear Dark Ages, we instantly imagine filth, backwardness, and ignorance? Why is this entire era painted with a single dark brushstroke, as if the lights of civilization were turned off for 1,000 years? The truth is, this image was not born in the Middle Ages. It was constructed later by those who had something to gain from rewriting history. The term Dark Ages was first popularized by Renaissance thinkers who looked back at the centuries before them with contempt. To elevate their own achievements, they needed to cast the recent past as a time of darkness. It was political, it was personal, and it was deeply unfair. Enlightenment philosophers followed suit, calling the medieval world a time of superstition and stagnation because it made their own age of reason look brighter by contrast. But what gets lost in that narrative is the truth. The thousands of quiet acts of resilience, innovation, and creativity that defined medieval life. People in the Middle Ages didn't see themselves as living in a dark time. They built cathedrals that still awe us, wrote poems that still move us, and developed systems of law, trade, and philosophy that laid the foundations for the world we live in today. And yes, the era had its horrors, plagues, brutal wars, religious extremism, but so does every age, including our own. What's dangerous is when we allow a simplistic myth to overwrite complex truth. When we do that, we erase the humanity of millions of real people who lived, worked, loved, and dreamed just like us. History isn't a line, it's not a march from ignorance to enlightenment. It's a web woven from suffering and brilliance, tragedy and triumph, backward steps and sudden leaps forward. The Middle Ages were not a void between the glories of Rome and the brilliance of the modern world. They were a world of their own, rich, strange, full of contradictions, and absolutely worth remembering. When we dare to look deeper, beyond the pop culture caricatures, we find not darkness but shadows that reveal more than they hide. We find forgotten cities that burned with learning, women who defied the roles given to them, peasants who outwitted famine with ingenuity, monks who preserved knowledge for generations to come, and craftsmen who made beauty from nothing. So the next time someone says, well, it was the Dark Ages, pause, ask, dark for whom? Dark according to whom? Because maybe, just maybe, the only real darkness is the ignorance we still cling to when we fail to see them clearly. When you hear the words the Dark Ages, what image comes to your mind? Let me guess. Filthy peasants covered in mud, diseases spreading like wildfire, superstition reigning supreme, barbaric violence in every town square, no science. No culture, no progress, just 1,000 years of suffering and ignorance, right? That's the story we've been told. In movies, textbooks, and pop culture, the Dark Ages, roughly from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the start of the High Middle Ages around the 11th, are often painted as a black void in human history. A forgotten time where nothing of value happened, a tragic, muddy pause between two glorious civilizations, Rome and the Renaissance. But what if that's not entirely true? What if the real story of the Dark Ages is more complicated and far more fascinating? What if those centuries weren't a collapse but a transformation? What if instead of being a time of universal ignorance, it was a time of adaptation, innovation, and even joy? Because here's the thing no one told you in school. People in the so-called Dark Ages danced. They sang songs around the fire. They fell in love. They baked bread, raised children, built homes, prayed, painted, debated, and occasionally they laughed. Just like we do, and no, they weren't just stumbling through 1,000 years of darkness waiting for the Enlightenment to save them. They had their own kind of light. It was different, yes, but it was real. They had laws. They had local governance, they built villages and even complex cities, they brewed beer, they composed poetry, They held seasonal festivals. They wore colorfully dyed clothing. They had medicine not modern, but rooted in centuries of herbal knowledge passed from generation to generation. They didn't think of themselves as living in a dark age. That label came much later during the Renaissance, when thinkers wanted to elevate their own era by casting the previous one in shadow. It was marketing, and like all good propaganda, it stuck. Of course, life in the early medieval world wasn't easy. It could be harsh, violent, unjust, but so could life in ancient Rome. So could life in 18th century Paris. What makes the Dark Ages unique isn't just what they lost after Rome fell, it's what they built in its absence. Imagine a world rebuilding itself from the ruins of empire. A world where people had to reinvent the way they lived, without roads maintained by Caesars, without the military protection of a sprawling army, without the centralized bureaucracy of a continent-spanning state. Out of that chaos emerged monasteries that preserved ancient books, villages that practiced collective farming, legal codes created by local chieftains, and oral traditions that kept myths and wisdom alive. This wasn't collapse. It was evolution. In this series, we're going to peel back the layers of dust and distortion that history and Hollywood has laid over this period. We're going to look at how people really lived in the so-called Dark Ages. And trust me, it's not what you think. Because behind the plague masks and iron chains, behind the stained-glass saints and muddy fields, was a world full of complexity, creativity, and yes, contradiction. This is the part of history that doesn't make it into the school curriculum, the part that's messy, human, real, so buckle up. The Dark Ages are about to get a little brighter. When we picture a medieval home, we often imagine a thatched hut, smoke curling out of a crooked roof, livestock roaming inside, and mud covering every surface. And yes, that image isn't entirely wrong, but it's far from the whole truth. The architecture of the early Middle Ages was shaped more by geography, community, and adaptation than by backwardness. Across Europe, from the windswept fields of Saxon England to the sunny valleys of Lombardy, people built homes from what they had. Timber in the forests, clay in the riverbeds, stone near quarries. There was no universal design, just practicality and resourcefulness. In many peasant communities, houses were built low to the ground, often with wooden frames packed with wattle and daub, a mixture of straw, clay, and manure. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. These homes were usually one-room structures. A hearth burned at the center, its smoke escaping through a small hole in the roof or simply seeping through the walls. Children and adults slept together on straw beds, sometimes separated from the animals only by a wooden partition. Why did animals live inside the house? Simple, warmth. A cow or a few pigs gave off enough heat to warm the space on a freezing winter night and kept predators at bay. For a family that owned little, their livestock were more than food sources, they were life insurance. But not all homes were bleak. As you move up the social ladder, from serfs to yeomen to landed freemen, homes gained extra rooms, lofts, storage cellars, even primitive chimneys. Larger farms might have detached kitchens or smokehouses. Some even had glass windows, though they were rare and considered luxuries, often reserved for monasteries or noble estates. And then there were the manorial halls. These were the residences of the local lords, built larger, stronger, and often of stone. They included large halls for feasting, wooden floors covered in straw or rushes, tapestries to reduce drafts, and small private rooms for the family. But even these noble homes lacked what we'd consider basic comfort: no toilets, no running water, no insulation. Yet still, a medieval home, peasant or lord, was more than a shelter. It was a living organism. It held smells of smoke, spices, hay, and old wood. It echoed with laughter, argument, lullabies, and prayers. It was a space not only for sleeping and eating, but for weaving, carving, storytelling, and worship. For most people, the home was also the workplace. Women ground grain, brewed beer, and mended clothing in the same space where children played and elders told tales of gods and giants. It's easy to judge these living conditions by modern standards, but that's not fair. Medieval people were incredibly attuned to their environments. They arranged homes to catch sunlight and wind. They planted herbs near doorsteps to repel insects. They knew which beams to repair when rot set in, which reeds burned best in the hearth, and how to insulate their clothing rather than their walls, and the idea that everyone lived in filth. That's a modern exaggeration. While sanitation wasn't what we'd call hygienic today, medieval people did care about cleanliness. They bathed in rivers, in barrels, in communal bathhouses when available. Soap made from animal fat and ash was common, and public bathhouses were part of daily life in many towns until the later centuries, when they were banned by the church in fear of moral indecency. What's more, homes were sacred spaces. In a world governed by seasons, superstition, and divine mystery, the hearth was not just functional, it was spiritual. It symbolized protection, tradition, and continuity. Fires were rarely allowed to go out. Charcoal embers were preserved overnight in ash to restart the fire in the morning, a ritual both practical and symbolic. The hearth was where families gathered to eat, where midwives delivered babies, and where deathbed confessions were whispered. So no, these weren't just dirty huts, they were warm cradles of memory. They were places where entire lifetimes unfolded, where meals were shared in the soft flicker of firelight, where lullabies echoed off the wooden beams, and where generations passed down everything they knew, through stories, through hands, through love. The Dark Ages, maybe, but inside those homes there was light. If you imagine medieval meals as tasteless gruel eaten in silence by dirty peasants, you're only partly right. The reality was far more nuanced and at times surprisingly sophisticated. Yes, life in the Dark Ages was shaped by scarcity and survival. Food wasn't always abundant, and crop failure could mean famine. But medieval people were not culinary simpletons. In fact, the way they grew, cooked, and consumed food reveals a complex culture rooted in seasonality, religious ritual, and regional diversity. Let's start with the basics. Bread was the heart of every meal across all social classes. For the poor, it was often coarse and dark, made from barley, rye, or even ground peas and beans. Wheat, being harder to cultivate and mill, was reserved for the wealthy. Rich households could afford finely sifted white flour, producing the kind of bread that was soft, light, and symbolic of status. But bread wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. In many homes, instead of plates, they used trencher bread, thick slices of stale loaf on which food was served. After the meal, these greasy trenchers were fed to dogs, beggars, or servants, unless reused multiple times until they crumbled. Next, the medieval pot stew was king. In a single cauldron, peasants would boil vegetables, herbs, beans, and occasionally scraps of meat. This dish, known as pottage, simmered all day. It was endlessly adaptable, the medieval version of a slow cooker. A traveler returning after a week might find the same pot still bubbling, with new ingredients added and old ones boiled down into oblivion. Meat was rarer among the lower classes, but not absent. Chickens were common, pigs were kept in many villages, and hunting small game like rabbits or birds was a constant hustle. Fishing, too, was essential, especially during religious fasting days, which banned meat but allowed fish. In fact, these dietary rules created a booming fish trade that helped preserve culinary creativity across the year. And speaking of preservation, medieval people were masters at it. Salted pork, dried fish, smoked sausages, pickled vegetables, they had to be. Without refrigeration, food had to last through harsh winters and between harvests. Salt was so valuable it was nicknamed white gold. Now let's go upscale to the noble feast. In castles and manors, meals were spectacles. Think roast swan with gilded feathers reattached. Dishes were often more about show than flavor, designed to impress visiting dignitaries and rival lords. There were pies filled with live birds, yes, really, eels shaped like dragons, and whole boars with apples in their mouths. Spices like cinnamon, saffron, and pepper were imported at great expense, a signal of wealth and worldliness. These ingredients didn't just flavor the food, they flavored power, but even among the rich, meals weren't eaten alone. Medieval eating was communal. People sat at long trestle tables, shared trenchers, and drank from common goblets. Forks were rare. Most ate with spoons and fingers, wiping their hands on cloths or even the table. Drinks. Water was not always trusted, especially in urban areas. So instead, they drank ale, a low-alcohol, homemade brew, or, for those who could afford it, wine. Children drank watered-down ale, and even monasteries brewed barrels of beer as part of daily sustenance. And yes, contrary to what you might think, medieval people cared about nutrition. They may not have known about vitamins or macronutrients, but they observed how food made the body feel. Monks and physicians followed the theory of the four humors, balancing heat, cold, dryness, and moisture. Too much pork, you might be melancholic. Too many beans, expect windy results, which they documented in detail. But more than anything, food was ritual. From planting to harvest to blessing the meal, food connected people to nature, to God, and to each other. Every season brought its rhythm: spring greens, summer fruits, autumn grains, winter stores. Feasts marked baptisms, saints, days, weddings, and death. Fasting wasn't just about hunger, it was about spiritual control. To eat was not merely to survive, it was to participate in the divine cycle of life. So no, medieval people were not mindlessly gnawing on bones in the dark. They fermented, foraged, pickled, preserved. They argued over recipes. They passed down techniques. They tasted joy in honeycomb stolen from a wild hive, in the first egg of spring, in the warmth of a shared stew on a bitter January night. Their table may have been rough, but their cuisine far richer than we've been taught. When we think of the Dark Ages, the first image that often comes to mind is that of backbreaking labor. A peasant bent over a field from sunrise to sunset, dirt under the fingernails, muscles aching, sweat soaking into a threadbare tunic. And to an extent, that image holds truth. Medieval life was rooted in toil. But what if I told you that people in the Middle Ages actually had more days off than the average worker today? Let's begin with labor. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, work was dictated by the land and the seasons. Plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting were crucial tasks, especially in spring and fall. There were also animals to tend, firewood to chop, repairs to make, and thatched roofs to patch up before winter's bite. But medieval people weren't working nonstop. In fact, the agrarian calendar built natural rhythms of labor and rest into daily life. Between the cycles of the seasons and the liturgical year, there were dozens of feast days, many of which were recognized as mandatory holidays, especially in Catholic Europe. Saints' days, holy days, and church festivals often meant no work, plus shared food, drink, and music. Some years, the number of non-working feast days reached as high as 80 to 100 days annually for peasants. Compare that with the average 2 weeks of paid vacation in many modern countries, and suddenly the Dark Ages don't look so dark. Now, let's not romanticize. Life was still hard. There were no labor protections, no insurance, no retirement. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A broken ankle could doom a family to ruin, and for serfs, peasants tied to a lord's land, a portion of labor had to be given to the noble estate. But it's also true that serfs weren't slaves. They had rights, they could not be arbitrarily sold, and many could own property, pass land to their children, or even buy their freedom. What about the nobles? For landowners, life wasn't work in the manual sense, but it was far from idle. Managing estates required constant attention, settling disputes, overseeing crop storage, ensuring taxes were collected, preparing defenses. Many nobles were also warriors, called upon to fight or organize local levies. The expectation of martial readiness and loyalty to a liege lord formed the bedrock of feudal society, but here's where things get interesting. Even among the poor, and especially among the townspeople and monks, leisure existed, and it was often colorful, rowdy, and unexpected. Take sports and games, for example. People played mob football, a chaotic, no-rules brawl of a game that looked more like a riot than a match. It often involved entire villages chasing a ball through fields, streets, and rivers. Injuries were common, windows were broken. Cows were trampled, authorities tried repeatedly to ban it and failed every time. There were also board games, dice games, and card-like games. The Norse played Hnefatafl, a kind of Viking chess. The English played Nine Men's Morris. Monks played quiet indoor games with pebbles and carved tokens. Gambling was rampant, especially during festivals, despite repeated ecclesiastical scolding. And don't forget music and storytelling. At night, around fires, families and villagers gathered to hear tales, both local legends and old epics. Bards, jongleurs, and minstrels wandered from town to town with instruments and stories in tow. Ballads of Robin Hood, tales of Arthurian knights, and fables from the Bible or folklore were shared aloud, memorized, and passed on across generations. Dancing was also a common pastime in the village green, during feast days, or in weddings. The church often tried to restrict dancing, especially if it looked too joyful or suggestive, but it persisted, woven into the cultural fabric of rural life. And then there's the tavern, the medieval social media platform. In towns and even in villages, alehouses and inns served as gathering points. People came to drink, talk politics, complain about taxes, hear the latest gossip, sing bawdy songs, and occasionally throw punches. Women often brewed the ale and ran the taverns, a fact that complicates the stereotype of powerless medieval women. In fact, some alewives became quite wealthy and were respected or feared members of the community. So why don't we hear more about these everyday joys? Because most of what survives in the historical record comes from the literate elite, monks, nobles, chroniclers, who weren't interested in preserving the lives of peasants, or the laughter around a village fire, or a festival that erupted into dancing and drunkenness. Yet archaeology, art, and oral tradition tell us they lived, not just survived. To be clear, the Dark Ages were not an idyllic paradise. Disease, violence, and injustice were ever present, but so was resilience, so was laughter. So was play. Behind every field plowed, every cloak mended, every child born in a smoky hut, there was a human being not just surviving, but finding time to rest, to dance, and to dream. When we imagine love in the Middle Ages, it's often through the lens of fairy tales. A chivalrous knight pledging eternal devotion to a noble lady, or a tragic romance between a beautiful maiden and a forbidden lover. But the real story of love, marriage, and sexuality in the Dark Ages is far less romantic and far more complicated. Let's start with marriage. In the early medieval period, especially before the 12th century, marriage was not necessarily a religious act. That's right, for centuries, getting married didn't require a priest, a church, or even witnesses. A couple could declare themselves husband and wife in private, and as long as both agreed, it was legally binding. This practice, called clandestine marriage, meant that love-based unions weren't as rare as we think. In fact, people often married for personal reasons, desire, compatibility, or even rebellion, long before the church fully claimed control over the institution of marriage. But by the High Middle Ages, the church began tightening its grip. Marriage became sacramental, meaning it was no longer just a contract, but a sacred bond overseen by God. This shift gave the church enormous power to regulate love and sex. It dictated who could marry whom, when they could marry, not during Lent, and even what kind of touch or behavior was considered sinful. Incest laws were expanded to absurd degrees. Cousins 7 times removed were considered too closely related to wed, and while we often think of arranged marriages as cold and loveless, they weren't always so. Among the nobility, marriages were political tools, alliances forged with land, titles, and power in mind. A 14-year-old girl might be married off to a 40-year-old baron to secure a border treaty. But even among peasants, families often had a say in who married whom. However, this doesn't mean love was absent. In fact, love sometimes bloomed after marriage, not before, a very different model than what we expect today. Now let's talk about sex, because medieval people certainly did. Despite the church's efforts to frame sexuality solely within the bounds of procreation and marriage, people were having sex for pleasure, breaking the rules constantly, and confessing it in droves. Medieval confession manuals, which priests used to guide penitents, contain hundreds of variations of sexual sins. Some are specific, some shocking, and many downright bizarre, but they reveal one key truth. People were doing all the things they weren't supposed to. Sex outside of marriage, common, same-sex relationships, more visible than you'd think. Monks and scholars wrote extensively about sodomy, a term used broadly to refer to homosexual acts, masturbation, and other non-procreative behaviors. While punished harshly when discovered, it wasn't rare. In fact, monasteries and abbeys often had secret scandals involving forbidden relationships. And what about women's sexuality? Here's where things get even more layered. While medieval women were often controlled and limited by societal roles, they were not universally passive. Widows had surprising legal freedoms and could own property, manage estates, and even choose to remarry, or not. In many communities, alewives, midwives, and healers were unmarried women who lived independently. Some were celebrated, others, sadly, were accused of witchcraft. Interestingly, medical texts from the Middle Ages show a belief that women had equal sexual desire, sometimes even more than men. Some physicians argued that a woman could only conceive if she had an orgasm. Others warned husbands that failing to satisfy their wives could lead to illness or infidelity. As strange as it sounds, this pseudo-medical view gave women a certain leverage in bed. But perhaps the most surprising medieval love stories come not from royal courts or dusty sermons, but from literature. The 12th and 13th centuries gave birth to the courtly love tradition, a poetic explosion of passionate, forbidden desire. Troubadours in France, poets in Germany, and writers in Italy crafted songs and tales of knights yearning for unattainable women, usually married noblewomen. These stories were about emotional intensity, not marriage. They glorified longing, heartbreak, and sometimes erotic fantasy. While not reflective of everyday reality, they show that medieval minds were just as obsessed with love, passion, and heartbreak as we are today. And let's not forget about the role of celibacy and chastity. The church held up virginity, especially female virginity, as the ultimate virtue. Nuns were brides of Christ, and saints like Agnes or Cecilia were revered for dying to protect their purity. But many medieval people mocked or resented these ideals. Folk tales and local jokes often poked fun at hypocritical monks or lustful priests. The tension between desire and doctrine was constant and human. In the end, medieval love was messy, layered, and full of contradictions. There was devotion and control, freedom and fear, desire and shame. People didn't live in a vacuum of oppression. They negotiated love within the world they knew. And even in a time ruled by feudal law and religious authority, they loved, longed, and lived with hearts as restless and romantic as ours. If there's one image that modern pop culture loves to reinforce about the Dark Ages, it's that nobody could read, write, or think for themselves. The stereotype goes something like this: 1,000 years of superstition, ignorance, and mental stagnation, only rescued by the sudden brilliance of the Renaissance. But that's a myth, a dangerous and lazy one. The truth is, the so-called Dark Ages were brimming with intellectual energy, just not in the ways we've been taught to admire. Let's start with literacy. No, the average peasant didn't read Virgil or study logic, but neither did most people in the Roman Empire. Literacy was always a privilege of the few. What's fascinating, however, is that monasteries preserved reading and writing as a sacred duty, even during times of war and famine. The scriptoria, those quiet, candlelit rooms in which monks copied manuscripts by hand, were not simply about religion. They preserved Greek philosophy, Roman law, astronomy, herbal medicine, and poetry. Without them, we likely wouldn't have Aristotle, Cicero, or even Plato today, and it wasn't just blind copying. Some monks began commenting, questioning, expanding upon the texts. Irish monasteries in particular became intellectual powerhouses during the early Middle Ages. In fact, there's an old saying among historians: the Irish saved civilization. It's not just poetic, it's historically grounded. From remote abbeys, ideas were copied, studied, and eventually re-exported into Europe when chaos settled. The so-called Dark Ages weren't a black hole of learning. They were more like a deep breath, a period of adaptation. But what about the universities? Here's the surprise. Some of the oldest universities in the world were founded during the Middle Ages, not after. The University of Bologna, established in 1088, Oxford 1096, and Paris 1150, became vibrant centers of debate. Their curriculum, not superstition, but logic, rhetoric, grammar, astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music, the seven liberal arts. These disciplines formed the foundation of Western intellectual tradition, long before the Enlightenment ever arrived. Students at these institutions studied Arabic translations of Greek texts. Yes, Arab scholars had translated and preserved many classical works that the West had lost, but the transfer wasn't one-sided. There was cross-cultural intellectual collaboration between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thinkers, especially in places like Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. Mathematics, medicine, and philosophy passed through languages, Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, creating an intellectual melting pot long before modern multiculturalism. And who were these students? Many were poor, many were clergy, some were ambitious sons of merchants, some were even women, a rare but not impossible occurrence. Noblewomen like Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the 12th century, weren't just literate, they were authors, composers, philosophers, and mystics. Hildegard wrote on natural history, medicine, and theology, and was widely respected in her time. Others, like Christine de Pizan in the 14th century, became vocal advocates for women's education. Education during the Middle Ages was also deeply practical. Apprentices learned by doing: blacksmithing, carpentry, brewing, or weaving. These were intelligent systems of learning rooted in observation, repetition, and mentorship. Farmers knew how to rotate crops with remarkable precision. Midwives passed down herbal remedies orally, which modern science has rediscovered centuries later. The notion that intelligence equals book learning, that's a modern bias. In the Middle Ages, intelligence came in many forms and often through the hands, not the eyes. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Was the church an enemy of knowledge? The relationship was far more nuanced than we're often told. Yes, the church imposed limits, banning certain texts, prosecuting heresy, and promoting doctrinal conformity. But it also funded libraries, supported scholars, and preserved the very texts the Enlightenment thinkers would later rediscover. For centuries, monasteries were the only reason Europe didn't completely forget how to think critically. In fact, logic and debate were central to theological education. The scholastics, medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard, argued fiercely, sometimes dangerously, about the nature of existence, the soul, and even God himself. These were not superstitious villagers muttering spells. These were philosophers engaging in complex dialectic reasoning, anticipating the scientific method by hundreds of years. So why do we believe the Dark Ages were so dumb? Blame the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Both movements, in seeking to elevate their own ideals, painted the past as primitive to make themselves look enlightened. It's historical propaganda that stuck. They needed a villain, and the Middle Ages made a convenient one. It wasn't until modern historians began revisiting the evidence that the truth emerged. The so-called Dark Ages were intellectually alive, just not in the way 18th century philosophers or 21st century TikToks would understand. In short, the people of the Middle Ages didn't lack intelligence. They lacked our tools. And still, they built cathedrals, composed symphonies, mapped the stars, healed the sick, and debated the divine, all without Google or ChatGPT. Maybe they weren't behind us, maybe they were just different, and maybe, just maybe, we've underestimated them far too long. When we picture the Middle Ages, we often see bleak gray stone, silent monasteries, or the chaos of war-torn fields. Rarely do we imagine color, music, or laughter, but the truth is, the medieval world was far more vibrant than most of us dare to imagine. Art wasn't dead, it just spoke in a different language. Let's begin with music. Medieval people didn't live in silence. From the lowliest peasants to the loftiest lords, music was woven into daily life. In fact, entire genres flourished during this time. Gregorian chants echoed in stone chapels, their haunting tones designed to reach heavenward. Minstrels strummed harps and sang tales of war and love in bustling market squares. And let's not forget the invention of musical notation, one of the most important technological leaps in music history. Yes, it happened during the so-called Dark Ages. This period gave us the foundation of Western music theory. Monks like Boethius and Isidore of Seville compiled texts on harmonic structure and the mathematics of tone. The Church, often unfairly portrayed as repressive, was a patron of music and performance, sponsoring choirs, composing sacred music, and maintaining a centuries-long oral tradition that gradually became written, preserved, and studied. But music wasn't just sacred. Secular music, songs about wine, women, seasons, satire, thrived in the courts of Europe. Troubadours and jongleurs composed lyrics about heartbreak and humor. In Germany, the Minnesingers sang of unrequited love long before Shakespeare ever penned a sonnet. Music festivals, folk dances, and processions filled the towns with rhythm. Even the peasantry had their own songs, work songs, lullabies, and tales passed down through melody. Now, onto visual art. Was medieval art simplistic compared to the Renaissance? Maybe, but simple doesn't mean primitive. The stained glass windows of Chartres Cathedral weren't just decoration. They were illuminated storytelling, designed to teach the illiterate the stories of saints, kings, and martyrs. Those windows shimmered with cobalt, ruby, and emerald tones that glowed like magic when touched by sunlight. No one looking at them in person would dare call the era dark. Illuminated manuscripts were another artistic triumph. Handwritten and painted by monks with infinite patience, these texts were filled with gold leaf, delicate borders, intricate calligraphy, and scenes from daily life, heaven, and hell. The Book of Kells, created by Irish monks around the 9th century, is a masterpiece that rivals anything produced centuries later. It wasn't just art, it was devotion in pigment. And then there were tapestries. These massive woven artworks didn't just serve as insulation in drafty castles. They were history books, battle records, romantic sagas, and religious lessons rolled into one. The Bayeux Tapestry, for example, is a 70-meter-long embroidered chronicle of the Norman conquest of England. Think of it as the Netflix documentary of the 11th century, except told with thread. What about entertainment? People in the Middle Ages loved to laugh, to gather, to be entertained. Fairs and festivals marked the calendar, not just religious holidays but harvest feasts, solstice celebrations, and local saint days. Jugglers, fire eaters, actors, and musicians all traveled from town to town, bringing stories and joy to communities. Medieval theater was surprisingly bold. The so-called morality plays often involved characters like greed, death, or redemption, and were designed to both educate and amuse. Games, plenty, chess and backgammon were beloved by nobles. Dice and card games were common in taverns. Children played tag, leapfrog, and blind man's bluff, games still played today. And let's not forget sports. Jousting, wrestling, archery, and even an early form of football. If you think today's crowds are wild, you should have seen a medieval tournament. Trumpets, horses, banners, it was a sensory explosion. In the village taverns, people told jokes, swapped stories, and sang songs deep into the night. In family homes, stories were passed down orally, generation by generation. Some of the greatest epics we know today, like Beowulf or The Song of Roland, were born in this setting, long before printing presses and paperback novels. And here's what makes it all so fascinating: none of this was accidental. In a world full of uncertainty, where famine, plague, and war could strike without warning, art and music were tools of survival. They gave people a sense of control, beauty, and permanence in a world that often felt fragile and fleeting. The so-called Dark Ages were filled with light, not always visible, but deeply felt. So next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were all misery and silence, remember this. Behind every cathedral wall, behind every monk's candle and peasant's campfire, there were songs being sung, colors being painted, stories being told, and joy being lived, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in full celebration.